hello Israel, hello world. So how to simulate the world? There are many problems to be addressed. The problems of the world are complex. There's climate change, there are financial, economic, and spending crisis, conflict, war, mass migration, terrorism, and maybe the biggest problem of all is the lack of sustainability, which causes a lot of those problems that I mentioned before. So the question is, will big data save us? We're certainly living now in an age of big data. Within just a minute, 170,000 emails are being sent, or hundreds of thousands of Facebook posts and Google queries, and all the data is being collected and evaluated. There are lots of reasons or excuses to do this, to save the world, for security reasons. Knowledge is power, and data is the new oil. And that brought us step by step into what some people call surveillance capitalism, a system which CIA Director Gus Hunt at that time, back in 2013, has characterized as you're already a walking sensor platform. And it's really very nearly within our grasp to be able to compute on all human-generated information. And that's a lot of information. I mean, you know, we're living in times of face recognition, and it's even possible to find your voice and listen to what you're saying through another person's smartphone. And Google even says, we know where you are, we know where you've been, and we more or less know what you're thinking about. So it seems like we have become pretty transparent to companies and also to the military and secret services. And so it seems like a natural idea to ask, can we build something like a crystal ball? In fact, back in 2008, Chris Anderson had a dream. He said, if we just have enough data, then we would see the end of theory. The data deluge would make the scientific method obsolete. And so the hope was that we would now be able to see what is wrong and fix the system where it's broken, and to build a crystal ball that would be able to see in real time what's going on in the world in any place, and maybe even look a bit into the future with predictive analytics. And people started asking, can we know everything? Can we understand the human body, brain, and personality? And that brought us actually in an age where there's not just big data about everything and everyone, there are also digital doubles, I mean, digital copies of you, agents that can be simulated in a computer. And for this, we're being profiled. There is a lot of data being collected about every one of us. Most people are not aware of this. Data about your salary, about your consumption patterns, about your social contacts, about your personality, about your weaknesses and strengths, and also about your health. So that has all been recorded secretly, probably without your agreement. And that kind of data is now being fed into black boxes that learn to behave like us. And so big data is being combined, of course, with artificial intelligence. And some people think you would soon see, or maybe perhaps it's already around, a super intelligent system smarter than people. And some people like Ray Kurzweil even predict that by the end of the century, even by 2060, we would have supercomputers that would be as smart as all human brains. I'm not sure about this, but you know, certainly within the century, expect some surprises. What's certainly happening is that in some places, people are working on what is called world simulation. So basically, you know, of course, many particle simulations, and in the social sciences, it's multi-agent simulations. So typically people have been represented by those agents, simplified versions of people, and their interactions have been simulated to understand certain social and economic processes. And now in the meantime, this method is being combined with neural networks and deep learning. So these agents are given a little brain that can learn. And so we're having smart agents learning, cognitive agents, digital doubles, as I said before. And these kind of systems are being fed with surveillance data, and they're being simulated at scales of millions of people or even the entire world. And the question is, what are the implications? Is this a good or a bad thing or both? You know, what could possibly go wrong? What would be the benefits? And among those things that some people now see critical is behavioral manipulation, because you're not just surveilled and profiled, you're also being targeted by personalized information. The system try to catch your attention, to influence your thinking and emotions and behavior. And some people like Tristan Harris, who worked in a Google control room for some time, this is even mass mind control. So he gives a really interesting TED talk entitled How a Handful of Tech Companies Controls Billions of Minds Every Day, and yours might be among them. You may not even have noticed, but what we've learned in the past years is that this kind of technology has been used to manipulate also elections around the world in at least 65 countries, as you can read in this book, Targeted, how democracy was broken. And in fact, we should see these kind of technologies as weaponized propaganda AI. So how does it work? Well, you know, the brain is really a wonderful and miraculous organ. It just consumes 100 watts of energy. And it's, of course, much more powerful than a light bulb, but it simplifies certain kind of processes. And that's why we have cognitive biases. And these cognitive biases can be used against us. We can be tricked, and as we've learned through Edward Snowden, these kinds of tricks are being used by secret services. This has been automated in a sense and digitized, and this is the way how we're being manipulated. So our weaknesses and strengths are being recorded in order to use them against us or for us, whatever, to make us behave in certain ways as marketing companies or as the military or secret service may want it to happen, or your government. And so this is creating something like a forced synchronization between people. It's kind of a remote control of people. Of course, this is not working perfectly, but to some extent, and to a much larger extent than most people would think and are aware of. Then, of course, the next question comes up. Could society be run like a giant machine? Once we know what are all the parts and how they behave, and these learning black boxes learn to behave like those parts, we can simulate the entire world in this way. Could we run society like a giant machine? And here's the challenge. So there are basically, as we physicists know, two kinds of situations in complex systems. There are stable states and unstable ones. So the stable states are the good weather kind of situation. When systems are stable, the individual behavior does not matter much. Now we are in equilibrium. Deviations from equilibrium will not matter because the system will return to equilibrium. But then there are also these stormy periods of instability, and when systems are unstable, they're likely to get out of control, but in unpredictable ways. And basically, really small deviations might matter. Anybody could make a difference, intentionally or not. And we've seen that, for example, also in connection with the COVID-19 pandemic. It turned out to be much more difficult than expected to predict the course of the pandemic. And of course, it's because of that instability. It's very difficult really to determine the parameters and saturation effects and turning points. Those data would come up only at a late moment of time. And even Google, with all its AI technology, obviously had difficulties to get along with challenges such as flu, because Google Flu Trends actually was turned off already some time ago. So the question comes up, do we know how to connect the dots? And actually, that question is not very trivial. Now, suppose you're seeing correlations between two variables, A and B. Does A cause B, or does B cause A? Or does a third factor, C, cause A and B? Let's take an example, a funny example, Like obviously the number of forest fires is correlated with the number of ice cream eating children, right? Of course, we know both is caused by external heat. But if we would just follow the correlation, we could think if we forbid the eating of ice cream, that would reduce the number of forest fires, which of course will not happen, right? There are also cases, and actually a lot of them, the more data you have, the more cases of this kind you will find, where A and B just appear to be correlated. So then we have spurious correlations just by accident, such as, for example, the correlation between the number of serial and rampage killers per capita and chocolate consumption. If that was a causal relationship, then obviously it would be very dangerous to live in Switzerland, but so far it has been quite okay. So in other words, there is a danger of overfitting if you have big data, and you would maybe see patterns that are meaningless, and you would respond to these patterns, and that could cause something that is not desirable. Now, of course, you might ask, what about AI? I mean, isn't technology smarter than us in many of these areas? Can AI fix those problems for us? And in many cases, probably yes, but there are also other problems. For example, this infinity sign is really hard to fit as soon as there's some noise around. And actually, the learning algorithms that we apply to society may not converge, because there are a lot of power laws or something which is close to power laws around in society and communication patterns and so on. So that poses unexpected difficulties that many people may not be aware of. And in any case, classification errors will happen no matter how much data you have. Of course, one example where that matters is pre-crime, hunting down terrorists. It is kind of shocking how many false positives there would be for every real terrorist. And then things become even more dangerous if there's a bias in the evaluation of data, as it has often been found in previous years. So some people would be discriminated against, and that's something that people have been working on now in order to improve those systems. But there's still the risk that innocent people would be suspicious based on the algorithms. And so one of the problems with AI is that in many cases, we don't know why AI concludes certain kind of things. It's kind of a black box, right? And that's why a lot of people are now asking for trustworthy, explainable AI. So we need understandable tools and explainable results. And that brings us from data analytics to data science, where basically statistical methods are being combined with computer science and mathematics and domain knowledge, right? So scientific knowledge in particular fields. And in fact, one example for how this can be done is described in this paper with Dirk Brockman, where we have basically shown that if you just look at appearances of new infections around the world, you would basically see uh, pretty badly correlated events, widely scattered data that are not really predictive. And that, of course, is a big disappointment, and it largely relates actually to air traffic. And if you then define a new effective distance based on the passenger volume between cities, and basically you get a new representation of the world in this new effective distance, and that would allow you to understand the spreading pattern as a kind of diffusive process, and that allows you to determine the origin of a disease as well as cities that would be hit next by a flu or epidemic or pandemic. So you could take some proactive measures to be better prepared. So in this case, basically, we've combined different data sets and some knowledge about the process behind that phenomenon, right? And this is actually the approach that's being taken further by computational social science. So before we had social physics, but now basically we have a largely interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary approach, which brings together computer science, data science, social science, ethics, engineering, and physics. And that improves, of course, the way we understand these kind of systems. In many cases, of course, we're talking about complex systems when we talk about the world. Now, what are the implications of those complex systems? Well, the interesting thing is, even though we have better technology and more data than ever, we seem to be losing control of the world. And that has a reason. The reason is that actually data volume increases much faster than processing power. So basically, there's a large amount of dark data, and we need to decide what data to look at in what way, which requires science again. But systemic complexity increases even faster as we go on networking the world. This is a combinatorial process, and it overtakes even data volume. So basically, we lose top-down control, and we need a new control paradigm. And fortunately, there's one called distributed control. So we really need to realize that society is a complex system, and it cannot be steered like a car. It's not a machine. And in fact, we see that very nicely in these kind of examples where you have many interacting cars. And then even if you could look into the brains of people, you could not stop this emergent pattern, so-called phantom traffic jams. This is an outcome of systemic instability. Nobody wants this, but it still happens. So basically, in complex systems, there's often an illusion of control. And we know there's also limits of predictability, for example, in weather forecasts, because of the physical phenomenon of turbulence, right? In fact, many of the problems that we have in the world today are results of systemic instabilities. And this concerns crowd disasters in the same way as, for example, unstable supply chains or even booms and recessions in the world economy. Could be unstable dynamics regarding crime in social systems, could be tragedies of the commons, such as overfishing or environmental pollution or environmental exploitation, climate change, tax evasion, and so on. Or it could be conflict or revolutions. And in fact, there are some systems where even the slightest variation could cause really a system-wide chaos. And a very nice example to illustrate this is the chain reaction in that experiment over here. So it starts with one local perturbation, and as you can see, it's messing up the entire system. Now, while this looks like a funny experiment, in fact, this has happened during the financial crisis. When Lehman Brothers went bankrupt, a lot of other banks also went bankrupt in a cascading effect. And so we need to realize that we're living in a highly networked world, and whatever you do will have an impact on other people, maybe even on the other side of the planet. And so besides intended effects, if they happen at all, there would be side effects, there would be feedback effects, and there would be cascading effects. And that requires us to think about systems in a different way. We would have to think about connectivity designs and mechanism design. So we need to understand that self-organization and emergence is happening in complex systems, and we need to learn to use it for us. So there would be a new paradigm to go away from this attempt of top-down control and manipulation towards an approach of empowerment and coordination, right? So basically go away from such an over-regulated approach towards learning to build systems that would support a self-organization of the system in favor of good performance. We've been working on this for a long time. So for example, we've been modeling pedestrians with a social force model, and that social force model that allows us to understand, for example, the phenomenon of spontaneous lane formation. It's an emergent process, doesn't require any laws or policemen. It just happens based on the interactions between the people. At bottlenecks, on the other hand, we would see these oscillatory flows. It's again self-organized, even though it may look like there is a traffic light, there's none. So again, this is based on self-organization. In fact, there is a pressure principle that allows us to understand that oscillatory flow. When there are intersections of flows, we might have stripe formation. That's kind of a generalization of the lane formation phenomenon. And understanding these self-organized phenomena can actually be used in order to improve all sorts of architectural designs, to come up with a different organization, for example, of intersections, but also corridors with narrowings and all sorts of other areas. And let's go to freeway traffic. The question is, can we understand the complex phenomenon of traffic flows? Now, if you look at these pictures over here, we think, oh my God, this is so complicated, we'll never understand it. But in fact, it's possible to cut down this complex pattern into certain elementary patterns, congestion patterns that appear again and again and again. And it turns out that these kinds of elementary congestion patterns can be understood well. They can be produced with simulation models, different ones, but actually a lot of models allow to reproduce these elementary congestion patterns and thereby allow us to understand actually what's going on in traffic. In one of those models, just to give you an idea, is this intelligent driver model, where we have an equation of motion and acceleration equation, and also a formula for the desired distance. But there could be also fluid dynamic models for traffic flows reproducing this kind of phenomenon. So based on these kind of models, we can actually derive so-called phase diagrams of congested traffic. And so we would understand what are conditions under which we have free traffic flow in green, or congestion, what kind of congestion. So that also depends, by the way, on the size of the perturbation. So there are some hysteresis or history dependence in these systems. Those systems really behave in a very interesting way. Now, the good thing is that this is actually reproducing or predicting even patterns that we find in real traffic flows, as you can see over here. So there's a good match actually. And we can say that we actually understand traffic flows, despite the complexity of traffic flows, quite well, to an extent that we can actually predict the delay times and the extension of congestion patterns pretty well. So there's even an analytical theory of traffic flow. I would say it's a triumph of physics that we would be able to understand, in a sense, a social phenomenon or interaction of many people of that level of complexity, and in many cases, as I indicate right now, in an analytical way. Now, that understanding has also led to improved traffic control approaches. So cars, of course, are getting smarter and smarter. They have a lot of sensors. That means they would be capable of perception, maybe communication. Cars could together recognize the traffic state, they could take decisions, respond to the kind of traffic situation, and so on. And they could automatically respond to the traffic flow, and we'll see how this is actually potentially dramatically improving the traffic situation. So in this computer simulation, you see first a simulation of stop and go traffic as we often have it today. And of course, this is pretty annoying. I would like to get rid of it. And now we're getting so annoyed that we decide to leave the car and take a helicopter, and that will allow us actually to see what is the reason for that stop and go traffic. And it happens to be an on-ramp where some cars are trying to slip into the freeway, which causes some perturbations in the traffic flow, which are being amplified by a cascading effect or domino effect, and that causes a stop and go traffic. Now suppose we would equip cars with a radar sensor that measures distances and relative velocities, and that would accelerate and decelerate cars in an automatic way. As you can see over here, if we do it in the right way, it could dissolve the traffic jam, even though there's still the same number of cars entering the freeway and the on-ramp, right? So we could get rid of the traffic jam by slightly changing the interactions, even if not every car is equipped with that kind of technology. And even though we don't have a traffic control center that controls everyone, the only thing that we did is we changed the interactions between cars slightly such that the traffic flow would be stabilized and the capacity would be slightly increased. So the question is, can this self-organization approach also be beneficially applied to other kinds of systems? For example, urban traffic flow, right? Where we often have that kind of situation, urban gridlock. Could we actually have self-organization as we see it at this intersection over here? I always find this intersection pretty astonishing, I should say. How the heterogeneous traffic, and still it seems like almost never anybody is being stopped. The trick is that we have unidirectional flow in front. In the back, we also have unidirectional flow in the opposite direction. And in between, we have a buffer that allows everyone to adjust the speed in such a way that there would be a gap for you to cross the flow. It works pretty well. Now, if we had also sound, then it would be also pretty noisy. Of course, now we have the Internet of Things, and the question is, how do we do that actually, such that we would have a self-organized traffic flow in a city, which is adaptive to all sorts of situations like building sites and accidents and pop concerts and soccer games and all these kind of things. And the question is also, do we need actually a centralized traffic light control for this? Now, we were inspired by the oscillatory flows of pedestrians at bottlenecks, and we said, couldn't we actually have a similar self-organized oscillation at intersections and use it to define a traffic light control? So could we have traffic flows control the traffic lights rather than the other way around? And how efficient would that be? As you can see in the simulation, there would be green waves that happen by self-organization. That's a nice thing. Question is, does it also work if you don't have this square grid as we know it from Manhattan or Barcelona, for example? And in fact, it does produce green waves also if you have an irregular grid, as I will show you in a minute. But the question is really the question about performance. You know, how would this decentralized approach perform as compared to a central traffic control authority, a traffic control center that acts like a benevolent dictator? It collects data from all over the city and then imposes a certain supposedly optimal traffic light control scheme on the city, even though we need to admit that because of the complexity of the control problem, the optimal solution cannot be determined in real time. So simplifications must be made. The second approach is actually a local control approach, where those cars approaching the next intersection downstream would control the traffic lights. The trouble times of those cars would be minimized. And so intersections would behave like Homo economicus, and everyone locally would try to do the best job, but there would be no global coordination. The third approach would be one which is like the second one, but there's a long queue. That queue would be cleared before we go back actually to travel time minimization. So it's kind of friendly with regard to the neighboring intersections. We would think the third approach should be the least performing. The second would probably be the second best, and the centralized traffic light control would be best. Surprisingly, these things are quite different. Red curve is for the centralized top-down regulation. As the capacity utilization of the intersection goes up, queue length increases as expected, right? If we have this Homo economicus approach, local self-organization, we have the violet dashed curve, and we see much shorter queue lengths for small capacity utilization, but then eventually the curve explodes. Queue lengths actually grow beyond limits. You know, so we have a monster traffic jam before we actually use the full capacity of the intersection, right? But the blue curve, which is for the third approach, the friendly local self-organization that coordinates with the neighboring intersection, that turns out to be better all the way. So we can make the invisible hand work over here. And We have actually applied it to an area in Dresden in a simulation study where the city of Dresden was not happy with the state-of-the-art control that they bought for a lot of money. They said, okay, if you think you're smart, show us what you would do over here. And not only is it a very irregular road network, there are also a lot of trams and buses cutting through this, and they wanted to prioritize them. And we managed to have green waves combined with a prioritization of public transportation. So as you can see over here, public transport gains a lot, but not at the cost of motorized traffic. Pedestrians also have a large benefit in cyclists, and by the way, the environment too. So this flexible adaptation to the actual local traffic situation and this coordination with neighboring intersections was enough to create a self-organized, coordinated situation that improves the performance of the system a lot in view of that complex optimization problem. Now, the question is, can we also extend that in order to solve the sustainability issues, right? In fact, today, every one of us is throwing away about 50 tons of things in a lifetime. And that's pretty bad because in many cases, there are things that could be reused, tables, computers, cars, smartphones, and so on. And a lot of valuable things are being just thrown away, and that causes that terrible unsustainability that is putting so much pressure on the world and turning into a threat to every country eventually. So either a lot of people would die, or we would eventually learn to turn supply chains into a circular economy. So we would reuse resources, and in this way, we could have a good standard of living for more people with less resources. But the question is how to get there. And this is really a matter of life and death, as we'll see. Now, fortunately, uh, there are now a lot of cheap sensors that we can deploy everywhere. So I'm talking about the Internet of Things. That allows us to replace the regulation approach that we've had in the politics of the past by a real-time feedback and coordination approach. So the idea is to build something like a public nervous net that would allow us to measure noise and CO2 and poisons and waste of all kinds and positive things too. And then the principle would be to create feedbacks to increase positive externalities should be the goal, to reduce negative ones, and to ensure fair compensation. But the point is, we wouldn't just give everything a certain value or price in dollars or euros or shekels or whatever, but we would actually have a multi-dimensional incentive system, a real-time feedback system, as I said, by combining the Internet of Things with blockchain technology. So we would introduce different kinds of incentives and thereby create new forces in the economic system in order to support a co-evolution towards a circular economy and sharing economy. So the main paradigm change is not replacing dollars by Bitcoin or using the Internet of Things, but the main paradigm change is to go from a effectively one-dimensional feedback system like money towards a multi-dimensional value exchange and feedback system. And that would allow to build a system that benefits us all. So just make yourself clear, the cities we're living in are basically full of different institutions that serve different kinds of goals, like education, health, economic prosperity, and so on and so on. So all of this is in one city, but it's being projected on a one-dimensional quantity such as dollars. And on the other hand, there's so many goals that we'd like to achieve: prosperity, sustainability, health, education, culture, and much more. However, the optimization approach that we often apply neglects all goals but one. Optimization is by its nature one-dimensional. Nature doesn't do such a thing. Nature is based on multiple feedback loops. It's based on co-evolution. Our body, for example, is really a very nice example for a self-organizing system, but it's not controlled by one variable, not even only by the brain. There are really many different feedback loops. And in fact, biological supply chains are very differently organized from the typical supply chains of today. So a metabolic network, for example, has cycles included. Many of today's supply chains avoid cycles, right? So something is different here. And maybe we should learn from nature, given that nature is more or less pretty perfect, if not at least very impressive circular economy in a sense, right? Here we have basically a reuse of all the resources, and that's based on a symbiosis in the system, a highly complex system. That symbiosis has evolved or co-evolved over millions of years of time, and I think we could really learn a lot from these kind of systems. Now, could we also apply this self-organization thinking to our society? And in fact, many people have been really amazed by swarm intelligence, It's so beautiful. And of course, these books about the wisdom of crowds. But the question is, when does it happen? How can we support it? How do we bring the best ideas of many minds together? How do we identify the best ideas? How do we combine them? And that is actually not so trivial. But we can actually learn from social species such as bees, where we actually observe that there is a multiple phase process going on. So phase one is independent exploration. In this phase, the individuals should not be influenced or manipulated at all. So that's going to come up with a diversity of solutions. And then in phase two only, there should be information exchange. And in phase three, then integrated solutions should be developed that have benefits of several solution approaches. And then in phase four, there would be a voting process among those integrated solutions. And note that contrary to what we have today and the majority voting system, this is not about winning. It's about finding solutions that work for many people. Here, it's not expected that everyone does the same. In fact, they shouldn't. Diversity is really important over here. And diversity is actually what creates better solutions to complex problems. And many problems today are, of course, complex. They require different perspectives on the same problem in order to get a better picture of the problem. And we also need to have solutions that would work for many different groups with many different needs. And actually,
4 minutes.
okay, this can be supported. So we've written a PNS paper about how to promote collective intelligence through optimal incentives. We've compared basically the yes-no majority voting-based approach of democracies with that of markets, with that of a third approach, which we call minorities report, where basically um, people are being asked to add some additional information to a new perspective basically to the judgment of a certain problem and its solution. This is actually better than the majority decision making and the market-based approach of today. So in conclusion, would big data and AI enable a wise king? Many people have asked. Well, of course, every country now is using supercomputer centers and powerful AI, but in the end, the purpose is to determine an optimal solution and to enforce it basically in that system, I mean, in that society. In many cases, it ends like this, monoculture, diversity is under threat, and that's actually not beneficial as it turns out. It creates a tunnel vision. And actually, it's quite dangerous because we're living in these unsustainable times, and some organizations such as the Club of Rome have actually predicted that we would see the downturn of economy around the year 2020, which is now, and it would have really terrible impacts on population in the sense that deaths would really skyrocket. So there are people like, for example, Roy Scranton has written Learning to Die in the Anthropocene, people who think, yeah, a lot of people will die, will have to learn to die. And there are people who've been working on such kind of systems, algorithms and autonomous systems to decide about life and death. And this is being applied now in some countries, even to do triage within the COVID-19 emergency that we have. My personal point of view is rather we should learn to live in these troubled times, and it would require us to rethink and redesign societies to become sustainable and resilient. And resilience requires diversity and decentralization. So should we combine cybernetics and synergy to build a cybersyn system, a global control room that controls everything on this planet using big data? Or should we combine it in a way to allow for the coordination and self-organization of the different parts of the systems in a flexible and adaptive way in order to cope with the challenges ahead? I believe in the second approach, and I think physics can make a lot of contributions to this. But as physicists, of course, we used to think about multi-particle systems. And we need to be careful because humans are neither things nor animals or robots. So, for example, there are these kind of feedback loops, right? So people self-organize into groups, and there would be group identity, and that group identity would change the way of thinking and behaving of the individuals in that group. People would also give certain things a meaning, and that makes social human systems very different actually from physical systems and much more interesting. Requires us to take into account responsibilities that we don't have when we have to organize a lot of things or machines or robots. We need to turn war rooms into peace rooms, make sure that there's more transparency, a democratic framework of operation, interdisciplinary teams to have this multi-perspective view on complex problems, ethical experts, participatory opportunities. And we need to be aware that humans are not just biological robots. There are a lot of things that cannot be quantified well, that matter a lot for people, such as human dignity, love, freedom, creativity, consciousness, and self-organization. So in a purely data-driven society that is AI controlled, those things that cannot be measured well would be easily forgotten. And that means all those things that make society human would actually be lost. And we shouldn't do such a thing. So we need to build in ethics into those systems. We need to learn to design those systems for human values. And that's why I'd like to ask you to think about using science to learn to build digital democracy by design. Thank you very much.